on the show today, and Betz. So sometimes I have someone on the show just because I hear good things about them. I want to get to know them. And Anne was one of those people. I was interested in neuroscience and coaching, and that's kind of her thing. Neuroscience coaching. She's a speaker, she's a trainer, but that intersection, I think, is what we'll mostly talk about. And honestly, in that area, there is a lot of bullshit and a lot of bunk and a lot of blaggers. And I said, who's the real deal? Who's a good trainer? Who's interesting? I can get on to talk about that. And a couple of people said, Anne, I saw on Coaches Rising, some friends of ours and a couple of other places. So Anne, welcome.
Thank you. You're right. There is a lot of bunk in the space, so we could talk about that.
Maybe we'll get rid of some of it today or clarify a few things. But I'd love to hear a bit about your story first, because we were just meeting. How did you get into what you do now? Like, what was your route into it?
I love that. I love that question. So I am a trained coach for 20 years. I never thought I'd do anything for 20 years because I have magpie syndrome. What's the next bright shiny thing? But so yeah, since 2001, and I trained at the Coaches Training Institute, and I was a trainer for them for a while. And about 12 years ago or so the other thing concurrently that I was doing was, it's a lifelong fascination, I think, since I was a teenager, search for meaning and what makes humans humans, what makes, and can we, the Buddha said, once you hear of enlightenment, you'll never settle for anything else. So I think it was kind of like that, like, what is this? And can we live in a more conscious state? And what does that even mean? And I was a philosophy major, so I've been kind of curious about that, I think almost my whole life. And so I had been working with my business partner in our company with a model of effectiveness, also consciousness. And it was great. If people bought it, they bought it. If they didn't, they didn't. Mm-hmm. And that to me was a crush point, because I didn't have anything to ground it in. So about 12 years ago, that's kind of when neuroscience poked its way more into the popular.
It got big, didn't it? It suddenly got fashionable.
Yeah, it's about 2010 is what we're looking at. It just kind of, there was enough people looking at it that it came into the leadership and coaching space. It had been going on, but at any rate.
Sure.
So I said to my partner, I said, I think we need to figure out if there's neuroscience behind our model. Like, can we ground this? And I went and studied neuroscience at the graduate level not to figure out coaching, but to figure out, is there a change as people go from more of a, we might think, and this is not accurate language, but we'll just use it anyway, from a more reactive state to a creative state? Is there a difference in their brain and in the whole system? Not just the brain, but how the system is responding. And so the end of the story is, as I got into this, what I kept finding that I hadn't been looking for was validation for coaching. Be like, oh, here's all this research on stress. And by the way, when you do these things, they will lower cortisol markers, which is a really good marker of stress. Yep. And I'd be like, oh, well, they taught me that in coaching school. Who knew? So,
and do you think, just to jump in if I may?
Yeah, please.
I'm sort of concerned that's become how neuroscience is approached by coaches, yoga teachers, different people, is almost like a justification. Like, it's like they kind of know it anyway. They're experienced people like yourself. They've done the coaching or the yoga or whatever it is. And then they look for the neuroscience, which in some way justifies it. And that has sort of two sides, right? Like, on the one hand, it's like, hey, there's some science behind what I've been doing, and that can make it more accessible to, here's a slide with a brain with a blob of color on it, great. And then there has a sort of another side that's maybe less healthy, of just sort of looking to sort of reinforce and justify.
Right. Yeah, validate existing beliefs. I think that's a legitimate question around it, because on the one hand, it's natural to say and be excited about, oh my gosh, here is this thing that I do. And I'll speak more about the coaching world because I know that better than the yoga world. Sure. But here's this thing that I'm doing in coaching. And when I learned it, all my teachers could tell me was, trust me, it works. Just keep practicing it, try it, it works. And I'd be with a client, particularly a client who was very logical and linear. And I'd be like, maybe we should get up and look at this from a different, place in the room. And they'd be like, why are we doing that? Isn't everything important going on right here? And if I could give them some, but yet, when they did it, they would have transformation.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, what I have said, what I would say is, if it works in human development, there's going to be a neuroscience explanation. Now, some of them might be very long and complicated. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be a one-liner usually, because we are way too complex a system for a one-liner. On the other hand, I do think it's important for us to keep looking at the neuroscience of human development and asking ourselves whether what we're doing is the best we can do. So that's kind of the flip side.
Yeah, well, let's take a couple of examples then. What's something you already did in coaching that you then went, great, there's this nice neuroscience explanation, and that can make it more accessible for people?
Oh, yeah. Well, let me talk about reframing, which is at the Coaches Training Institute, we called it balance coaching. Technically, it's called cognitive reappraisal, reframing. It's taught in NLP. It's taught in cognitive behavioral therapy. It is a classic in the human development movement. It's to say, here is this way that we can shift the way we look at things, even if we can't shift all the data. We can shift how we are thinking about it. Well, what the research in reappraisal in neuroscience says, that when you shift how you are viewing something, it has a tendency to lower a stress marker called cortisol. And cortisol is not in and of itself a stress hormone, but if cortisol goes down, it will tell you other stress hormones have gone down. When our stress hormones are in the proper balance, we can find solutions more easily. And so, what I started seeing about helping someone take a different perspective is, this is quite interesting to me. It doesn't matter if I had you in a process where we looked at, something from 4 or 5 different perspectives. And then at the end, I said, okay, now what would you choose? It doesn't matter which perspectives you explored. What matters is the process is helping your brain come to a more balanced state where it's not flooded with stress chemicals that are making it hard to think more creatively. So that was a pretty cool thing. It's like, okay. You get people to a state where they're more capable.
Mm-hmm. What about the other way around? So this is sometimes, I think, rarer. What was a piece of neuroscience you came across and went, oh, I need to change what I'm doing?
Yeah. Good. Okay. That's good. Or refine it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe refine it. So I'll go to a very controversial one, and it's one that people often use badly, and there's lots of neuromyths about it, and that's right and left hemisphere. So, you can go on Facebook and you can do your little test, and am I right-brained or left-brained? And it's a very, very layered area. There's a lot of myths around that. However, we do have 2 hemispheres, and they do process information differently. One tends to go more focused to the details, and that's the left hemisphere. One broadens out and looks at the big picture, and that's the right hemisphere. So one of the things that I refined in coaching is that if I had a client who was kind of all over the place and more chaotic, what I started learning is what's happening is, circumstantially, they might not be a right brain person because we don't think that really exists. But in this moment, vis-a-vis this topic, mm-hmm. and this is valid, they have gone to a more open state where they can't filter information, and it's put them into chaos.
Yeah.
So when I've got a client there, I don't ask them about possibility. I don't ask them about, what would be possible, or put yourself 10 years in the future, because what that's going to do is add to the openness and the chaos.
You could already see they've got plenty of that going on. So I'm going to ask a clarifying question or a question.
I'm going to say, okay, given everything you're telling me right now on this call, what's the one thing that's really important right now? What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this open space and I'm going to narrow it. Same is true if I've got a client who's kind of gone into rigidity and they're very narrowed in their thinking. I am not going to say, what are 3 things you need to do right now? Because that's adding to that energy. I'm going to open them up.
Right.
And so I was taught coaching tools that were more like, this is just a good coaching tool rather than when do you use what? And I don't think the coaching schools traditionally have been very good about that.
Yeah, sort of lack of sensitivity to state as much as anything, and then what fits with that state. Like, you don't stress too, right? I'm sure you can talk about
exactly
this stress.
I mean, it's like if I've got a client who's highly stressed about something, the last thing I'm going to do is add more stress by giving them a really challenging or
This is what my clients in Ukraine really need right now. It's some more stress.
Oh, they really like. Where are you playing small? Right? No, they don't need that. Now, if I've got someone who's kind of laggy on that and all of that, and they're under stress because our brain likes just the right amount of stress and they're not moving forward, then I might be like, hey, where are you playing small? What's a gulp for you?
Make comfortable
your class in the Ukraine, they don't need that. Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
That's a nice say, something like make the comfortable people uncomfortable and the uncomfortable people comfortable, right? Like this what's going together.
And you're not just doing that because it's nice. You're doing that because according to the brain, that is what the brain needs, So when I've got this is another thing I changed. I've got a client, I'm thinking of one in particular, who's having trouble making plans to move ahead, but she is in a situation personally that is a consistent influx of stress. She's living with someone who's very unpredictable and not very nice. And so she's beating herself up. Like, why can't I, make plans and all of that? I'm like, the first thing we need to do, I don't need to work with you on plans. I need to work with you on helping you get your brain in a state where it can see plans.
Yeah. The embodied shifts in the kind of way we'd work. And I find this sort of polyvagal model very helpful.
Yeah, I love that. Yep.
Like in Ukraine, I was using that a lot. Just going, okay, this person can't listen right now.
Right.
This person's already feeling in danger. What can I do to help that out? And I find that very useful looking at, for my own as a coach or a trainer, to go, is what I'm about to do helpful or not? And there's a sensitivity to feeling that. And also for normalizing things in other people. Like I had a student in Ukraine say, I don't seem to be learning very much. It's not going in. What's wrong with me? I feel stupid, they were saying. I'm like, well, you keep getting bombed, so maybe your brain isn't working to take in new information right now. And like being able to explain it to people so they go, oh, okay, now it makes sense why
you are having a neurotypical response to overwhelming stress. I had right before COVID, and I never got to do this. I was booked to speak at the Association for Training and Development. I was so excited about it, and then they canceled the conference. But the title of my talk was because this was for trainers and organizational people. The title of the talk was How to Make Your People Stupid.
That's a great title.
What a great title. I want to use it. Anybody wants to book me, I've got a great talk.
Or even though we can work on that even more, how about the management prefrontal lobotomy?
Yes. I like that.
Like how to make your people's neocortex not work or something.
Exactly. So overstress them or undervalue them. There's a really, and this is, it's not just nice. We have nice things that help people have work-life balance. It's critical because, my argument would be, and I'm preaching to the choir here, is we want this part of the brain and its impact on the whole system, including the body, to be in balance because people will be at their best.
They'll work better.
So there's diminishing returns. And, if we look at Finland and looking at things like, 3 or 4 day work weeks, you're probably looking at, our brains are probably best in balance at about 32 hours a week, right?
Oh my God, the dream. Fuck you, Finland. I'm jealous of the Finns. I taught there once, I rather like it there. Nice pace of life there as well. Slow, out, have a sauna.
And they found, as I understand, and I don't know, I'm going to go deep on the research, but I think what they found is there was no drop in productivity.
Because it doesn't surprise me because of the
you're getting brains at their best, and then you're giving people reset time rather than this idea that time equals productivity, which it's one of the exciting things I think we're seeing in this day and age, that there's poking into that sort of embedded view in organizations that you should be the last car in the parking lot kind of idea. I think we're starting to see that disrupted. It's not disrupted yet. But.
Yeah, a lot of time working with work-life balance with corporates and Ukrainians and everyone else. And I think I'm just starting to get the brain The idea of the brain that when we're creative and safe and connected, we're also intelligent. Like that's a grouping, right? Like you can maybe tell me more about the exact neuroscience, but when people are unsafe, they are also uncreative. They are also stupid. They're also not learning, and they're also not very ethical or very nice. So we have a sort of mixture between the cognitive, the moral, ethical, right down to, why did I shout at my wife last night? I love my wife. It's like, because your brain was in that state where it was. So I'm just getting, I think, really as a manager and as a leader for the first time, how connected those things are.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big one. Is there a particular place that would be at, part of it, let me talk big picture, is part of it is that our brains operate on a first principle, which is survival. And that's not news to you or anyone else, but it's how do that's one of the people that I follow in this space, just love her. And we've brought her into Coaches Rising, brought her in, and I brought her into the ICF, is Lisa Feldman Barrett. Just brilliant. By the way, if people are interested in, look her up. In the book, I'll just give one book here, because if you want a basic book on the brain, people have been asking me for years, like, what's the best book on the brain? And be like, well, what are you interested in? I don't know anyone who's covered it more comprehensively. And then she wrote the book, and it's called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. Lisa Feldman Barrett, highly recommend. But she basically sort of cheekily says, the only reason we have a brain, I don't know if it's cheeky or not. I think it's really her truth, the truth as she sees it. The only reason we have a brain is to manage, to keep our body alive and manage what she calls our body budget.
Okay, so she's talking about sort of what's high and low sugar expenditure or something like that?
Sugar, salt, hormones, etc. Everything that goes into running this body. The brain, the reason we evolved into this complex brain is to keep this very complex system alive. And so back to your point about, why did I shout at my wife, etc. Why are some of these things so hard, is that the brain is trying to operate on the lowest amount of energy possible, and the lowest amount of energy possible are the most habitual patterns.
So this is the idea of sort of, when you're stressed, you do what's efficient, even if it's not particularly intelligent, because it's the old, they're wired together, they're fired together. So you're burning, you're just doing what people will revert to those old kind of patterns.
Yeah, you do
not the best way to operate.
I think about this fun research study on Israeli judges, where they looked to see when they were most flexible in terms of sentencing.
Oh, yes.
And it was right after lunch.
Yeah. When they're eating, you don't want to be sentenced before lunch. I heard
exactly.
that. Yeah. No, exactly. That one. Not a good one. And I mean, you sort of think about this as levels, do you? So do you think of it as sort of like survival? Because there's different ways of cutting this more or less accurately neurologically, or more or less depending on the audience, right? Like, Porges has his. Well, do you think of survival mode, threat mode, functioning mode, creativity mode, enlightenment mode? Like, how do you kind of?
You could put it along those lines. It's pretty classic. One of my favorite quotes is from a French theologian, Teilhard de Chardin, and he said, everything that rises must converge. And so I would say that is a very good basic, through line when we think about levels of consciousness, however it is divided up, or whatever system anybody's got. There should be no proprietary, this is the only way to look at it. It should be convergent, because if it's not, something's off in one system or the other. Truth rises, would be my view. So that would be very much in line with what we call our 7 levels of effectiveness. We break it down to 7, but it's very much, survival to, the survival levels that are less functional levels, to the more courageous levels, to the more open and creative and, possibly enlightenment levels, just as you said.
You're talking state or level though here. I mean, it sounds like you're sort of Wilburite kind of trained, like
stage or state. This is a whole very layered conversation. It can function in a couple of ways, just sort of like I said about right and left hemisphere. I can be in a place where I'm or with a person where I'm consistently in an open and creative state. I might have someone else in my life, my mother, who's passed away now 10 years, she could reliably put me in a state of fear. Just really good at that.
This is what amuses me about the sort of, I love the stage development staff, Wilbur, Keegan, but I'm like, is that you on a good day or a bad day?
Right, exactly. Or who are you with? Or
who are you with? Where are you? Have you had lunch?
Right. Is this about money? Is this about work? Is this about your health or your body? So the way that we think about it, and this came from my business partner, Ursula, I love this insight. She said it's like a radio wave.
Okay.
And everyone has a home frequency. And that wherever you are sort of as your steady state, you're not going to be there all the time. And you're not going to be there vis-a-vis everything in your life and every person. You're going to go higher. Sometimes you're going to go lower. On any given day, you're going to be in this radio frequency. So when I think about increasing my own effectiveness, I don't think about like, I got to get to this next level. That just seems so egocentric and narcissistic. It's more, how do I move my radio wave where maybe I don't go quite as, I don't go quite as often to my, the state where I have no empathy or where I'm very, rigid, but I know I'm a human and I include all of this. Yeah. So.
All right. This is great. I'm enjoying this.
All right.
Let's get back to just speaking out loud. Let's get back to neurobunk. So
neurobunk. Okay, neuromyths.
So what are some of the myths? I'm thinking of calling this episode Neuromyths. People love a bit of myth busting. They love a bit of neuroscience. Yeah. It's the perfect combination. And it's been, neuroscience stuff's been around quite a while. It's been popularized. Left and right brain. What are some of the sort of more commonly held neuromyths out there?
Yeah, probably the biggest one. And I think what's really cool about this one is people are starting to understand that they should question it. But probably the biggest one is the idea that we have a reptile brain.
Okay.
And that we can use it. And what follows from that is we can then use that as an excuse, right? I was, I had an amygdala hijack. I have this reptile brain, and that the brain evolved in 3 layers.
Yeah.
And you still, even recently, even last year in 2021, and this is a person that I admire greatly for many of her contributions, but Brené Brown was doing an interview, I can't remember with who, and they started talking about the triune brain. And I'm sure you know this, Mark, that is probably the biggest myth, because if you think about it, nothing evolves that way. Nothing evolves intact. And the triune brain model says we have this reptile brain when we were reptiles, and then we layered on this,
I'll tear off my human skin, and I'll be a monkey underneath that, and I'll tear off that.
Right, exactly. And that each of these brains sort of takes over, right? Doesn't work that way. And it's really back to Lisa Feldman Barrett. She has been such an advocate for debunking this myth. And you still hear people say like your amygdala is, or you hear people say like your amygdala is the seat of emotions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or this part of the brain is the place of memory.
Okay. So the idea that parts do a function, which isn't the case, right? There's always.
Exactly. It's a system. The brain is it's a system of systems. And so I'm very careful about what I say. I speak very carefully and I say participates in.
Nice. So there's a couple of myths. So let me just go back to triune brain theory, because it's pretty much like the standard. This is how you explain certain things. Is it the sort of redeemable, oversimplified model that just could be explained better? Or is it like, no, just don't use it, it's wrong? Which way would you go with that?
I'd go, don't use it, it's wrong. And I think the more that you use it and the more educated the general population gets, the more it's going to destroy your own credibility.
Yeah, I've said to my students, you better hope there's not an actual neuroscientist in the audience.
You better hope there's not somebody who's read a good New York Times article,
right now, it's even
read Lisa Feldman Barrett's book or whatever. You better, forget the neuroscientist. You better hope there's not an educated person out there.
Do you have an alternative for like okay, you've got a 20-minute, lecturing part of your training. Maybe I'm doing a 4-hour stress management training. I feel like hitting my business people up with a little bit of neuroscience just to kind of help things out a little bit. What would be your alternative then for that?
It's a great question. I love this. And so, because I had to think about it, it was so handy. It was so easy. It was like, and people resonated with it. They're like, oh yeah, I can feel my reptilian brain and all of that. Not true, not accurate. There are some reasons why it resonates with us. Let me give you one. One is that the lower parts of the brain, like the amygdala and the limbic areas, limbic is not a system. There are areas that we call limbic areas. They don't necessarily work together as a system. So I'm careful about that. That's fine tuning. But often the strong emotion that we have, it often has an origination point there.
Okay.
So that's why it often feels like I'm having an amygdala hijack or my reptile brain took over, because that may be where the initial impetus arises, but then the emotion is going to be constructed using the whole brain and the body. So the way that I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, okay, if I can't use that metaphor, darn it all. Thank you very much, Lisa Feldman Barrett, because she's the one who first cued me that this was not right.
Sure.
What am I going to do? How am I going to talk about this feeling? And so the metaphor that I use is that your brain is an orchestra.
Okay.
And sometimes parts of the orchestra get really loud. So I think about when I'm really upset or narrowly focused. I had this problem with a class that I was teaching, not my own, but they were having me use this system, and my camera wasn't working with the system and my mic wasn't working because I couldn't teach the class. And it's like 2 minutes before class. And it's like, there are parts of there's a thing happening. There's a stress response happening, back to what we were talking about before, that is making it harder for me to think clearly. And so what I think about that is, oh, in this case, it's like my drums have gotten loud. And it's not, and the difference is, it's not that it's the only part of my brain operating. It's drowning out the other parts of my brain that are very much operating.
Can we make it a rock band and not an orchestra? Just a bit.
You can make it any band you want. You can have your own. You can have your own band.
So, oh no, George Ringo Starr's bass is now louder than John Lennon's vocals. This is a real problem.
Right. And here's what I love about that. Sometimes in some music and sometimes in life, it is really useful that the drums are causing your attention. Like there is a real threat. And it's useful that your focus narrows and the other thing that happens with you, because you need to respond to that threat. But the idea that you don't have the rest of your brain, and let me give you a little technical thing that I think is really interesting. One of the reasons why people were saying, oh, I'm having an amygdala hijack or my reptile brain is taken over, is that if you do a brain scan of someone in a stress response, this is, as I understand it, I hope it's accurate. If you do a brain scan and you do it at fairly low power, which is how they often do brain scans because it's a very power hungry machine. Okay. So you do it at fairly low power. What you will see is the most active parts of the brain. But if you do a full, and so you might just see, oh my God, all of the activities in the amygdala. If you do a brain scan at full power, what you will see is, there's a lot of activity there. There's a lot of blood flow there. However, there's still activity in the rest. So the rest of the orchestra is playing, just not as loud.
Okay, so sort of another way of looking at things. All right, so we've got the sort of triune brain myth. You mentioned sort of left-right brain stuff. I think it's been sort of, vastly overdone, and people get sort of put in boxes. You're a left brain person, you're a right brain person. I heard you sort of skeptical of that. The idea of location, places being the center of the thing. I think, that seems to be because it's more distributed networks, how things work together, right? Is that fair to say?
Yep.
Any other common ones that what makes you face palm and eye roll and want to punch someone at the same time when you hear it said by NLP trainer number 772?
I think those are the big ones.
They're the big ones.
Those would be the big ones. I want to say, and then I'll tell you the sort of the general one though that does make me want to face palm. The general one, then I want to go back to just one particular thing about right and left hemisphere, but the general one that makes me go, is when people claim things are based in science that are not.
Okay, science says very clearly.
Yeah, well, your brain, this is the brain, and they really don't know, and it, and so, I've been looking at neuro-linguistic programming right now, and just the idea of using neuro in that to me is a difficult term, because people have an assumption that everything that happens in there, people understand the mechanism by which it's happening in the brain. And
it's a power claim. It's a power claim. And this is where you have some strong suspicions of the sort of neuroscience world, as applied particularly to leadership coaching and training, not so much the actual scientists in Cambridge or whatever doing their thing, is that it's a status claim and a power claim. It says, I'm a priest. I'm part of a priestly class. And it's like when you listen to medieval, priests sort of, I have access to God and you don't, peasant. Yeah. That's the flavor of it sometimes that I object to. And another part of that for me is often it's not really doing anything new. It's just putting fancy long words, and sometimes taking a lot of time in training to do it, putting long words on things. Yeah, we all knew that. And how does that help? Just by giving it, we could translate everything we've just said today into Greek, and that wouldn't help.
Oh, it didn't help. Well, there's this great quote, and I think it was Richard Feynman. It was not Einstein. It gets attributed to him, but it's basically the shortened version of this is, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I think there's a cleanness to being able to explain some of these things with clarity, and also know when, the whole process of emotions it takes me about an hour to explain, to really walk people through the current research on how emotions are constructed with the body and the brain and memory and prediction. I can explain it simply, but I can't explain it quickly. And anybody who tells you emotions are this or that, my view is probably wrong.
Well, I'm a British man. I don't have any, so I don't have to worry.
That's right. Well, my British friends like to say, "Oh, I'm having an emotion."
I'm having an emotion privately. I might write a poem about it later. It's none of your business. Jokes aside, do you think sort of cultural factors are here? Because we talk about the brain as if there was one, but given that there are anatomical differences, a Maasai doesn't look like a pygmy. One of them's half the size of the other. We might expect different populations have different brains as well. Not ethnically perhaps, but are these studies done on Maasais and Pygmies and Aboriginals, or are they done on students in Harvard?
Here is my understanding of this. Probably the most research and the most fascination is, can we prove a difference between the male and female brain? And that's probably where the most is. And what my take on this is that our brain differences are largely, almost completely socialized.
Sounds like liberal propaganda for me. I think we should get a conservative neuroscientist on to give the opposite point of view.
You can totally get that. In terms of male-female brain, and this is one where people are very, very fascinated. Our male brain is different than most of the differences has to do with sort of body size and brain size.
Okay.
Right. So men tend to be bigger. So when they say men's brains are bigger, it's more accurate to say bigger people's brains are bigger. Right.
I would respond to that by saying elephants' brains are also bigger, but it doesn't.
Right. Exactly. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about how you process that. There is some impact in terms of what hormones we get swathed in the womb. But for the most part, as I understand male-female brain difference, just because we went there, and that is a myth, another neuromyth, if you have an average neuroscience look at a brain scan of a male and, give them one of each, they're not going to be able to tell you which one's which.
They couldn't tell you from a brain scan.
They couldn't tell you from one brain scan. There is some tendencies, but you can't just say, yeah, this is a female brain, this is a male brain. That is something where, it's a bit of a yes and, but largely the biggest differences are cultural. And so back to your Maasai or pygmy issue, we know things that it depends on, it's not depends on your genetics, although we can talk a little bit about that. It depends more on where you were raised. So if you take a person of Japanese descent and they are raised in New York, their brain, depending on what's happening at home, but, so maybe say third generation pure Japanese DNA, their brain's going to process like, any other person raised in the US. Vice versa. If you take me, I'm Scandinavian, take me, raise me in Japan, everything around me is Japanese way of thinking, my brain will develop that. And there are differences in terms of, give you an example, you might know this one, in terms of how the brain sort of tilts to processing. And so if you give a group of American raised students and you have them look at a fish tank and you ask them to describe the fish tank, what you will more likely get is descriptions of the individual fish. If you take a group of Korean students, which is where they did this, have them look at a fish tank, what they will describe is the environment of the fish tank. This is a little bit more of a cultural right brain tendency with the Korean, and this does play out in other Asian countries, little more of a cultural shift to the right brain versus in the US, a little more shift to the left brain.
Well, it does make sense. The brain's pretty malleable by definition, almost, it's a malleable organ, unlike sort of height or some other things.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that it would be culturally adapted, as otherwise culture wouldn't exist as a thing.
And also, if you probably took someone, I'd be curious, there's probably people listening here who, have moved from their, place of birth, fairly young and move to a different culture and find after a certain number of years, they think more in alignment with that culture.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I've lived in a few countries and it's definitely even it takes 3 to 6 months for a culture to sort of really leave a mark on me permanently is what I've discovered. And certainly people have, I've known friends who live 20 years and I joke with my wife, she's getting more English every day, but
Well, yeah, absolutely. Because we are meant to, I don't know, so how do I want to say this? We are relational beings. And we actually, this is maybe the other neuromyth. Let's go here for a minute.
One more, okay, let's do it.
It comes back to the embodiment piece, So this might be one of the biggest neuromyths. You should get better at your own brain. You are an individual. You should brain hack yourself. You should totally, do everything within this system and particularly get your own personal brain better. And you're going to be more effective if you develop individually.
Yeah.
Especially this right here in the skull.
Individual brain as opposed to collective.
And what the current thinking, and this is actually something, and I'm sure know this, but this is something that came out of, was a contribution originally from philosophy. And I believe, it's Andy Clark and David Chalmers. And I want to say it goes back to the 90s. And I think my names are right. I think it was Andy Clark who left his laptop behind on a train. And he called his colleague, David Chalmers. I'm probably ruining the story, but it's something like this. And he said, I feel like I've lost my mind because I left my laptop. And from there, Clark and Chalmers developed this very fascination and robust inquiry into something that in philosophy, and now it's crossing over to neuroscience, what they're calling the extended mind. At the time, they had difficulty getting the paper published because this was pre-smartphones. So the idea that your mind extended out
I think now most people would get that if they've ever left their phone at home and gone for a walk. It's something part of you feels missing.
You know,
by the way, I'm taking notes on my phone, so if you see me tapping away, I'm not texting my mom.
Totally. I mean, it's my cat, I don't have to, I have externalized my memory.
Yeah, I don't remember anything. Why would you?
Why would you remember phone numbers? Why would you remember, what you need to do that day? It's not a good use, and our brains aren't good. Our brains are not super, you can get good at it. You can study memory, but why would you want to when you can extend it? Well, there's a wonderful book. I'll give you one more book, and it's my other big favorite book. It's by Annie Murphy Paul. She's a journalist. She wrote a book called The Extended Mind. It is one of the most brilliant things I've ever read in my life. She is brilliant. And what she does is she looks at how trying to develop this in ourselves is a losing game. It's not going to make you the best or smartest. What's going to make you the most effective is figuring out how to use mind extensions. The number one probably being each other. We are, you and I are smarter together, talking.
Yeah, teams are critical.
Polishing. So her 4 areas, if I can remember them, are each other, relationship, the body, extending our mind. And, and I think about, you probably know my good friend, Mandy Blake. I don't know if you've had, I've
had her on popular episodes.
Yeah, Mandy. Mandy is my bud and my go-to for embodied wisdom and embodied knowledge. So using the body, using the physical environment and externalizing. And this can be anything from putting things on a whiteboard to moving objects around.
Yeah, it really helps people think, really helps people.
Right. It could also be just, how do you set up your training rooms so that it is most conducive to a particular way of processing? And then the 4th way is technology. And often when we think about the extended mind, that's the one that gets all the attention. But the other 3, you don't have to pay for, and they're at our fingertips literally at any moment.
Yeah. The relational element makes sense. We are almost.
That's how to get smarter. That is how we get smarter.
I have smart people around you. I always said the best way.
You extend your mind into every way possible. It's how you do better training. It's how you do better coaching. It help your client extend their mind. That to me is the biggest neuro myth, and the biggest neuro myth busting is, don't work on this in here. Don't worry about that. Work on all of the extensions. And get that book if you want to know more about it. It's brilliant.
Look her up. Did you mention sort of neuro atypicality earlier? Maybe just to finish. So there are sort of, I'm someone who's pretty ADHD. I've got cousins on the autism spectrum. Is this something I think my wife's a type of neuro thing they haven't labeled yet. I think.
What did she do?
Lots of very cool and interesting. She's basically a cat, but she's famous amongst my students. But I won't go into the details. She's wonderfully weird, but there's no name for what she is. She's not autistic. She's not a psychopath. She's not ADHD. But I suspect there's a category waiting for her in the future. I think we're going to find a few more categories that are kind of neuro atypical that aren't sort of dysfunctional enough to really need treatment, but they're a bit different. Any thoughts on neuro atypicality?
Yeah, and the way that I love that, I want to meet her because I'm basically a cat as well, so that works for me. She might be a highly sensitive person. That might be the category. I think that I used to talk a lot about neurotypical or but to some degree, I maybe there's only this much neurotypical and there's this much neurodivergence.
Yes.
I've kind of flipped my thinking about that, and it's part of the uniqueness of who we are. But I used to think of it more as a limiting thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the way, the way that we're socialized to think, autism spectrum, Asperger's, ADHD, I have a sensitivity, I have I have a processing challenge where a lot of noises will trigger me.
I understand. Always telling restaurants and taxis to turn the bloody music.
Yes, exactly.
Multiple stimuli. I like to turn it around though. I like to say to people, do you normal people need me to speak slow enough for your weird brains?
Right.
I think there's a way we can always reverse it, right? It doesn't have to be disability. So
no, and I think about, like my sweetheart is he's a little bit neurodivergent. My brother as well. They have powers of concentration that blow me out of the water. Holy shit. And so I think of it more as, what are the gifts of each of these things? Nothing comes, even ADHD. I mean, there's an energizing there. There's an ability to, and a need for complexity that can be part of that. I think it's more, how do we uncover some of the gifts of these things and help? And just like there's a gift to being maybe neurotypical, but there's a limitation sometimes. So everything is the way that I would look at it. And
nice. Okay, well, thank you. We did need to wrap up. This has been good. I've enjoyed it. I hope we talk again, Anne.
Me too. Yeah, this has been fun.
Invited to come and guest teach on some of our programs and job interview over, past. No, so you'll be invited, no doubt, to teach your future stuff. I like your style. I will look up those books you mentioned. Do you want to mention the books again? Because people always ask.
The two books are two of my favorite books right now. 7.5 Lessons About the Brain by Lisa Feldman Barrett. Very accessible, really good. And then The Extended Mind by Annie Murphy Paul, and just take your time with that one. Mine's got flags and underlines all through it. That one, if you are a facilitator or a teacher of any kind, it'll up your game. I have brought some of her ideas into my teaching, which was already pretty effective, and noticed that it has increased student understanding of certain things.
It looks heavyweight. And do you have a book out?
I have a book out. It's called Integration, The Power of Being Coactive in Work and Life. It looks at the Coaches Training Institute's coactive model from a neuroscience perspective. I also have a book, and that one's available on Amazon. I also have a book on the neuroscience of the International Coach Federation's coaching competencies, updated in 2020. That's on my website at beaboveleadership.com.
And shout out to all our CTI friends, lots of CTI friends who work with us and come on courses, very, very good experiences of coaching and CTI. So I just want to give them a bit of big up. Where do people find your stuff specifically? Where's the place to go?
Two places, beaboveleadership.com, my main website, and that has our programs on neuroscience and coaching. Also trauma, neuroscience and trauma in coaching.
You've hit the two most trendy things going on there. You must be selling a million copies of that.
Hell yeah. So, and then the other one, if you're just looking, I've got a blog that has a lot of stuff on coaching and neuroscience. It's called Your Coaching Brain, and it's yourcoachingbrain@wordpress.com. www.yourcoachingbrain.wordpress.com.
And I need to go, but this was great. Really,
this is super fun. Thank you, Mark. I had a great time.
Thanks for joining us.
To be continued.